My name is Jessica Ho, and I am the Government and Community Affairs Director for Northeast Medical Services, a federally qualified health center based in the city. And my connection to San Francisco is through my family. My family's connection to the city is a really, I think, cool story. I was born in 1987, and I met my grandmother when she was already living in Sunnyvale, but she had lived 8 years in San Francisco before that and Taiwan before that. My grandfather, unfortunately, never met him, but he died at a hospital in San Francisco and was buried in Colma. But the last place he lived was in the Sunset. And my grandmother was a really awesome woman. I think she really defined who I am a lot in my growth. She couldn't have children, so she actually adopted my mother at a time when women were not desired in China. So I thought that was pretty amazing that my mother would not be alive if it weren't for my grandmother. And my grandmother also was just a very smart businesswoman. She and her husband, my grandfather, invested in homes in the Sunset, so we had property. Even though, like, in the 1980s when they moved here, I knew there was still racism and but apparently at that time a lot of her friends already lived in the Sunset, and they chose to move to San Francisco out of everywhere else because they had heard in their home country, Taiwan, that it was a welcome place for Chinese immigrants. So that's why they chose San Francisco, and then because of their friends, they chose the Sunset District, and because of that, they bought homes there, and because of that, I lived there. So it's kind of, that's the connection. So when I was born in 1987, I did not. I was not in San Francisco. I was born in Los Angeles County, and my parents had moved there for work. But we would come up and visit my grandmother in the Bay Area very often. She lived in Sunnyvale at the time, but we'd go up to San Francisco from time to time. And when I went to college at UC Berkeley, my parents moved up to one of the homes she owned in the Sunset District. So I spent the last year of my college going to Berkeley, also living in the Sunset District. And then after that, my parents moved away to Gilroy, but I stayed in that house. And I went to school at UCSF. And then, so I wouldn't be in the Sunset if I didn't know where to go. I didn't know where the Sunset was. I didn't know anything about it, but that was where my parents, that's where they lived. They told me to come here, and I started my life there, and I fell in love with the Sunset and the city.
And if you don't mind me asking, are you still in one of the homes that your grandparents bought, or?
No. So I, after UCSF, I went to Johns Hopkins to get my master's in health policy and public health, and my parents, I think they were not sure what to do with the house, so they sold it, which is really unfortunate, because I did, go to school, and I did internships here and in Sacramento and DC, and then ended up finding a job in LA, but then coming back to San Francisco. And when I asked my parents about the house, they're like, oh, we sold it. And so I had to find a flat that I paid like $2,500 a month for, a 3-story walk-up, 1 bedroom, 1 bath, on Irving and 20th Avenue. No, so now I have moved, and I'm now living in one of the newest buildings in the Sunset District, the ones that, it's called the Providence Complex, where the hospital used to be, and now there's a lot of, I think there's about almost over 80 housing units in that complex. It's a bunch of homes kind of geometrically on top of one another, but because of that, it works out perfectly. We have a 3-bedroom. We bought it in the pandemic. It wasn't the best price, but it was actually it was nice because we were not outbid. I had looked for housing before the pandemic, and every time we put in an offer, we were outbid, so it was really awful. And then we just happened to find this opening, and was lucky enough to secure it. So now I own my own place in the Sunset. So I guess my story is unique in that I don't think I was old enough because my grandmother was like 70 by the time I was born, and my grandfather wasn't there. I don't think they really shared that piece with me. I think the only thing I can really speak to is they struggled with language access because they moved here in their 60s and 70s. They could not speak English, and so my grandmother tried to learn English, but really just couldn't communicate with people, and I think she really struggled a lot with that. She also didn't learn how to drive, and so that was also difficult for her getting around. So I think these were barriers, but not necessarily from her purchasing her own home. I don't know how it was for her because I wasn't there with her. What I do know is that something I've learned from my grandmother and her surviving friends in real estate that I don't really see in mainstream real estate is that in Chinese, let me rephrase. My grandmother went into business with many of her friends in order to purchase property, whereas I don't know if that's the case for people who can afford a home right out. So, like, she owned portions of homes, she owned portions of parking lots, she owned portions of shopping malls. She didn't own the whole thing, but she went in partnership with people she trusted, which I thought was really interesting because even now I don't go into business with my money with my friends to purchase property. That's not something I think about, but for them, that was their way to survive. Yeah, like I mentioned, my grandmother chose the Sunset because she already had friends living there. And so that was why she decided that area rather than any other, like Chinatown, for instance, which I thought was really interesting. She loved shopping on Irving Street. She would take the L car to Chinatown and do her business there, but she liked living in the Sunset District. She didn't like the weather, that's why she moved to Sunnyvale, um, which I thought was pretty funny. But yeah, I think that was a big factor. Having friends who could speak her language and make her feel comfortable, especially at her age. I think that was really a big factor of why she chose the Sunset in 1980. I'm pretty sure things were different in 1880. Actually, I don't think there was any housing out there in 1880. I think there were just sand dunes at that point. But yes, I think that was a big factor in her choosing San Francisco. Was the Chinatown, the thriving Chinatown, her friends in the Sunset. It was the closest. It's actually the closest point to Taiwan of America, besides Hawaii, I guess, and Alaska. But like of the mainland. So I think that was also a factor. And for me, I think what's fascinating is that when I first moved here in 2009, I was really amazed by the number of second generation, third generation Chinese Americans in the Sunset. I've never seen this growing up. Even at Berkeley, I didn't see it very much. It was just, they were like Americans, but Asian looking, and it was amazing. And even their parents spoke fluent English and were cool and just very Americanized, and I didn't have that experience either growing up. So I think that really, for the first time, changed my whole perception of what it meant to be an Asian American, and I really loved it. And I think that's one of the reasons why I continue to love the Sunset, because I think it's a place where cultures actually have melded together and to become something new, to just become a new type of American. I think the problem with the Sunset is that it hasn't changed over the years. It hasn't grown with the times. I think I mentioned earlier in this interview that in 1880 there were no homes, and in 1980, by then Chinese people could own homes, and in between then was a lot of other stories that I'm sure you'll cover with your other interviews. And I think that now it's been 50 plus years, and that I live in one of the newest homes in the Sunset that was built in 2000. So, I mean, that just speaks to how the lack of growth in the Sunset in terms of housing. is the reality we face today. I would say that the majority of my friends, and I'm in my 30s, probably don't own homes right now. Like they don't live in the place they grew up in. A lot of the people that I knew who were still living with their parents in their 20s, I don't think they are owning their homes. They may rent a home or a flat in the Sunset, but I think that speaks to not only an issue with the Sunset District. I think that's just a housing issue in America, but also exists in the Sunset District. I do recognize that there hasn't been a lot of proposed housing or housing that's been approved in the Sunset. I know that's something that's being discussed currently. And I think that while building more housing is definitely part of the solution, I also do think that it's important to recognize the price of housing, and not everyone may have the privilege of being able to purchase a home as well. I don't have any children, so I don't know if I can speak to the family aspect of things, but where I live, there are families and a lot of people who live in the same units that we do, and it's difficult. Like, I think everyone would like more space, right? Everyone would love a large yard, and that's the closest you can get a Sunset, but it's not the same as living in in a suburban area, but at the same time, that's not why we chose the Sunset. We don't want to be living in suburbia, but we also don't want to be living in the middle of the city. And so I do think that this question has many layers. I think that because people who can't afford to live in the Sunset or San Francisco in general are moving further away from San Francisco, and not to other states necessarily, but just to the East Bay, to the South Bay, to the North, however they can find affordable housing. And I think that does change the dynamic of people who are living in San Francisco, just because, as anyone knows, we spend our time with the people who are closest to us geographically. And now that the pandemic is over and we're doing things in person, if you're not physically there, you're not going to build the same type of relationship with someone as if you were physically there. So I think where you live does make a difference in how you live your life. So I do think that where you live will, or where people live will definitely shape and influence how San Francisco's culture becomes, and also how we see and view children and families. And I think it's actually a story yet to be seen. I think we're still writing it as we speak. Sure. So renting is difficult because as a person who's trying to come in the city, we don't necessarily have the privilege of rent control, or rent control prices per se. And so they're a little outrageous. And I know that I've heard some of the prices have come down through the pandemic, which is great. But yeah, I think no matter if you're paying $1,000 or $2,000 or even $5,000 for rent, my family's philosophy is if you're paying rent to someone else, you're paying down their mortgage and not paying down your own, which over time it's just not going to be a beneficial thing for you. And so that's why it's always better, in our opinion, to buy a home, because whatever we pay to the mortgage company eventually does benefit us. So that's why I always knew I would want to buy a place. But when I started looking, I didn't think I had enough funds, because I had, just started a new job and I tried saving, but, it's hard in these times. And I actually went to, just randomly, because I used to intern for Carmen Chu, she had, when she was an assessor recorder, this finance literary event in this south east quadrant of San Francisco, like somewhere in the Bayview, I think. And I was like, all right, well, I'll come and support like Carmen, but not that interested or live in the Bayview. But I went, and they made you sit down with financial counselors, and they were asking you questions. I'm like, look, I'm just here to volunteer. I don't know what you want me to do. They're like, well, you're here, so like, let's talk about your finances. I'm like, okay. And I'm like, he's like, what's one of your reach dreams? I'm like, I would love to buy a home. He's like, why don't you do it now? I'm like, well, because I don't have enough funds. And he's like, let's like think about that, right? And be creative with what you have and how you want to achieve that goal, and start your plan today. And because of that, I think it really inspired me to like think about it, because I was like, no, I'm not. I was 31 at the time. I was like, I'm not gonna buy a home. Like, no one else knows. I don't know anyone else who has a home in San Francisco. Like, I've already bought a place in Sacramento, but that's like, you know, very, very different prices at that point. So yeah, like, I didn't really think about it. But I talked with my parents, who I've, you know, have a lot of experience in real estate, and we came up with a plan and figured out, you know, what I could potentially get in a mortgage. We applied for a loan, which was a long process. But at the time, we had really good interest rates. I think that's not the case right now, but I was able to lock in a very good interest rate. And after that first phase is complete and you have the financing, I think then the rest is just finding the house. And so we went to maybe like 20 open houses, all around the Sunset District. I even looked at places outside the Sunset District that were potentially cheaper, like Ingleside, the Portola. Like, I looked at other locations, but we put down 3 offers, and every time we put down an offer at that time, we were completely outbid. And it was like ridiculous that I think there was one that was listed for $1.2 million, and you know, of course you want to put something better than that, but then it eventually got sold for $1.6 million cash. And so we're like, there's no way that we would have been able to compete with that. And I think another really difficult situation, at least when I was buying in 2020, was that because it was a seller's market, the buyers really couldn't ask for any contingencies. If the house was in complete dilapidated state, they wouldn't do anything to fix it. It would be sold as is. You wouldn't know really sometimes about the structure of the house and why they're selling it. You would just have to take it at face value. Like, you wouldn't know if you inherited like a ticking time bomb. So that was always a concern. A lot of the homes in the Sunset are unpermitted. There were a lot of unpermitted houses that have in-laws, which automatically excluded my interest, because I didn't want to go through the planning process of writing that process. So yeah, that was also a problem too. And yeah, there were just a lot of issues. I think understanding what the Sunset means to me is a hard thing to verbalize, because as with maybe other people, it's more of a feeling, more than something I could really explain. I think there's just this magical feeling, and I'm not usually into. I'm a pretty scientifically minded person, so I typically like to follow up my statements with reasoning, and but when it comes to where you live and personal choices like who you love, those are things that you can't really explain logically sometimes. And I think that's kind of what the Sunset is to me. It's when I first moved into my place, our place in 2334 29th Avenue, I felt for the first time like I could be myself and I could breathe. And I've never felt that anywhere else. So the question is, do I think that there are communities in San Francisco that are more well-resourced. I mean, I would be a fool to say no. I wouldn't say that they have everything that you listed, like transportation and public services and restaurants and dining and entertainment all in one area, but I definitely think certain areas are more well-resourced because of the people who occupy them, right? And so, for instance, let's just take Seacliff, for instance, right? There are no nearby restaurants, nearby hair salons, nearby culture centers. It's just a lot of nice houses and nice views, right? And then China Beach. But does that mean they're more well-resourced? There's no transportation that goes there, really. I mean, they actually don't want that. So I don't know if being more well-resourced necessarily translates to a wealthier, well-off place, per se. Whereas, let's say Chinatown is extremely well-resourced, but the people who occupy a lot of units in the Chinatown SROs make less than minimum wage, less than federal poverty level. So does that better? I don't think so. I think that the point of people coming through Chinatown is not to stay in an SRO, but to move out and be able to find their own place and space, and not only physically, but, you know, in the world. Transportation. Please, for the love of God. Please, for the love of God. Our public transportation out there is all of it.
Just all, yeah.
All of it. I want it faster. I think this is actually very timely because El Terravel, I'm on the board of People Parkside Sunset. I worked for Katie when she was supervisor, and we really did not like that project, or we wanted to make sure that it didn't impact businesses. And NEMS has 4 sites on Terravel, and yeah, it impacts businesses, and it's terrible, and it's really something that we can't help because it has to get done. But I mean, that's the conundrum, right? We need better transportation, but then do people really have what it takes to endure all the construction and changes that need to happen for it to happen, right? And we just don't know because we haven't experienced it yet, and we haven't, at least in my lifetime. I would love to take the 28 every day to work, but sometimes if I miss the bus, it's like 10-15 minutes. I'll take it back because I don't have a time constraint, but, you know, I just don't have that. Or the 7X hasn't come back since the pandemic, or the NX, which I really love. Those are probably some of my favorite lines. The 28X was also great. Like, these rapid lines that are meant to move people around on, I think those need to come back to the Sunset because we are really far away from the central core maybe of other places that we want to visit in the city. It's also extremely impossible, or extremely difficult, if not impossible, to get to the southeast side and the Mission through public transportation. It's really just, I tried, it doesn't work. I actually think it's easier to get to San Jose at this point from the Sunset than it is to get to the Mission, because I've done it, because we have a clinic in Lundy, which is close to the new Milpitas BART station. So I took the 67 bus to the Milpitas BART station, to the Muni, took the N home. And I was within like an hour and a half. And I couldn't do that from getting the Sunset to the Mission. Like, I could technically take the N down to downtown and then transfer, but like, it's just a circuitous way, right? Whereas like driving does in fact take less time, which unfortunately is why, you know, but there's no parking out there either, which is, it's a conundrum. It's all difficult. So I think public transportation would be a really great asset to the Sunset. And there are a lot of people, for better or for worse, that don't drive, who live in the Sunset and really rely on buses. Like, my husband and I share a car, so at least we have that. And I really like the scooters. Those are really cool. And all other alternative ways of like biking or skating, or however people get to where they need to go. But it also is nice just to have a workable public transportation system. It can really change the quality of life. I'll tell you a story about when I was in Baltimore. because it changed my life about how I saw public transportation. I've always loved buses, but when I was in Baltimore, I didn't have a car. I didn't really, never lived on the East Coast, I didn't know how it was like to live in Baltimore. I didn't really understand living on the hospital campus, was living one of the worst places in Baltimore. And so I did that when I first moved in, and I ate pretzels out of the vending machine. There was every restaurant, even in the hospital, closed at like 10 p.m. And like, for the first couple of weeks, I starved. There was only one bank that closed at 5, but then I walked in 4:45 and like, we'll close. I'm like, we'll close at 5. And I'm like, no, we close at 4. Anyway, so I couldn't get quarters, so I couldn't do my laundry. And I remember just being so miserable. Like, I really didn't know how to survive. And I know that has to do some part of just growing up and living in a new space, but also it was incredibly challenging within the walkable space. And plus, on top of that, Baltimore is at least where I live, was a pretty dangerous area at the time, and it was not uncommon to be attacked, and so like you couldn't really walk by yourself a lot. But Stephanie Rawlings Blake, the then mayor of Baltimore, started the Charm City Bus Program, and where she would just have buses circulate for free from where I live to Fells Point to Federal Hill, and to the downtown area, and it just circulated so I was able to take the bus down to places that I felt safer in and do my shopping and get access to things, and it changed my life. It really did. Like, I don't know what I would do without that bus system. And I would sometimes run, and I could, because running is safer than walking, so I could run to Fells Point and the harbor, and then take the bus back when it got dark, and I felt safe that way. And public transportation can save lives. I would, that's a really big question as well. I think that you're gonna elicit different answers from different people. I don't know if I'm the best person to ask about that. I mean, of course I'm going to promote NEMS because we're health, but we're already very populated in the Sunset, or in the city too. I would say, for the purposes of this question, if I could recommend anything that you guys as planning could do to improve our lives, it would be whenever new buildings are built, to build elevators in them, because there's no elevators in the Sunset, and as people age, getting up those stairs are not easy. And so I've seen a lot of people use these like movable chairs that kind of move up and down the stairs, but doesn't seem very like a long-term solution. It doesn't seem like a long-term solution. I think that the people of San Francisco are a little bit more self-selected than maybe other parts of the world. I came to San Francisco because I felt of the way I felt free and able to express myself in ways that I couldn't express myself in other places. I think that might be the case for other people as well. So I think that in that sense, we're always going to hopefully attract like-minded people who are more open-minded maybe than people who are just the general population. And I think that does add to the uniqueness of San Francisco. I think the events, like the festivals, the community events, things that are open to the public, our public libraries, everything that our city tries to make accessible to people, including large festivities like for Chinese New Year, like Pistahan for the Philam community, like Pride, like the North Beach Festival. These are all just some examples of events that really celebrate the uniqueness of different cultures and different people and different ideas in San Francisco. And I think that's it's really nice to see that. I think that's really helps show not only ourselves but others who we are and what we value and what we like and what we want in life. I would say that as someone who helped plan the North Beach Festival this year, the planning process can sometimes be very difficult, and actually I would think that more festivals would happen if the costs and the logistics were not so prohibitive. My idea of affordable housing is someone who can afford housing. I mean, it's not that difficult of a concept. I think we make it difficult sometimes, but it's, if we really want to just look at the data, whoever you ask, whatever they make, find out what they make and make them pay 30% of their costs on housing, and I would consider that affordable housing. I'm not a planner, so I'm gonna caveat that I don't know what is possible with housing, and I don't, I know there's a lot of different factors that go into where you can build and how you can build and how high you can build, not just planning, not just necessarily zoning, but just nature can be prohibitive sometimes. But I would say that if we could go taller, that would be fine with me.
And what does that mean to you and look like to you? Is that the 50-story building in the outer Sunset at the beach, or is it, smart growth along, say, our transit corridors if we extend out the muni service?
I would like to see smart growth along the transit corridors. I think that we already have an opportunity to do that because the zoning for Irving and Noriega and Taravel, I think even parts of Judah and Lawton, we haven't reached those height and density limits yet. So there's already room there to grow along transit corridors. I think the caveat is, do we have enough transit to serve the increase in people who live in those transit corridors and around those transit corridors? But I also think that if we could make it easier for seniors to go up and down, I don't see why we can't increase the heights of most of our buildings and just have maybe 4 stories, not necessarily, I think 50 stories near the ocean where it's expected to be under the ocean at some point is maybe not the best planning choice, not only because it may not, factors of wind and rust and, how the ocean eats things, but also there's a high possibility that it may be the beach soon. So I don't know if that's really the smartest plan, but I do think that there are ways to increase density in a smart way in the Sunset District for sure.